Um, apparently the interface to on Chromebook everything has changed.
We don't necessarily have to show something. We're happy to talk through it if
Why
that's
don't you
easier.
why don't you talk initially, and then when I move to the desktop, I'll enable that sharing.
Okay, got it. Sounds good. So first of all, thanks everyone for having us as part of the committee agenda today. So what we wanted to do today is introduce ourselves and kind of tell you a little bit about VIA and about where we have done similar types of studies for other partners. And then Dan's going to walk you through kind of what the scope of that would be. And I'll say that we originally were introduced to Ray through Bill Wagner before he went to CTAA, and he invited us to do a presentation for rural healthcare of South Central New York. And we've had some very good engagement since, and I think we're very excited to present to you today on what we can hopefully do for the county. So it looks like we're at the top of a screen there. I think that's actually me, which is very crazy. Okay, so okay, sounds good, Ray. So just to give you a bit about who we are. So VIA is a transportation technology company. So we provide software and services to help our partners plan their communities, whether that's fixed route or on-demand planning, including doing feasibility and other kind of transit consulting studies. And then we also have technology on our platform that allows our partners to then kind of bring those plans to life through a set of operational tools that are rider, driver, and operator facing. And then we work with about 600 entities worldwide who are using our platform for either usually for on-demand or kind of more demand response services. We power everything from on-demand public microtransit to ADA paratransit, non-emergency medical travel. We also work with K-12 school buses on student tracking and dynamic routing for buses, traditional yellow buses, as well as dynamic shuttles for universities and large organizations. What we also do is transit consulting.
Sorry, that's me. Sorry, everybody.
Ray, I thought you ran a radio show. But at any rate,
Radio show is easy. I'm working with 1970s technology. Okay, Dan, go back, please. Go right ahead.
Okay, no worries. Actually, that's kind of a good setup in that, a lot of when we think of transit technology, a lot of it in terms of an ability to do dynamic dispatch and routing, right? And if something is not supply driven but demand driven, be that like a pre-booked trip or an on-demand trip for a smaller zone in the moment, the technology to connect the driver and rider and pool collectively riders that are going in the same direction and put them on the best vehicle for that shared journey. That is what we got our start as a company doing, and kind of bringing us from 70s technology to 21st century technology, and allowing ultimately our operator partners to be able to handle different subservices, be that paratransit, be that fixed route or non-emergency medical travel from one centralized dispatch platform. But before we're kind of working with you as an operational partner, oftentimes what we do is have Dan and the VIA Strategies team work with partners well ahead of time to kind of do transit and other types of consulting studies related to mobility. And so I'll hand it over to Dan to give an overview of his team within VIA and what specifically we could potentially do for Delaware County.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Berkovitz. So I lead a team at VIA called VIA Strategies, as Eric was describing. We're a dedicated transportation planning and consulting team. So, we're a group of folks with either a planning or a consulting background, and all we do is advisory services and feasibility studies and service plans for transit networks. A lot of what we do is related to on-demand or demand responsive transit planning. We started doing this work a few years ago because there was a lack of expertise in service planning for on-demand transit service. And, VIA was sort of going in and in some cases operating pilots and things like that, that maybe were not designed or planned as best as they could be. And we thought, here's an opportunity to contribute and to set these things kind of up for success, hopefully. We've grown a lot from there. We now have, just under 10 people. We work all over the country and actually globally as well. And we've done about 80 projects over the last few years. A majority of those being related, again, to on-demand transit or demand responsive service planning. We have worked all over the world, oftentimes in rural communities and smaller communities, hard to serve areas, right? I would say is kind of our specialty. But, closer to home, we did some work in Suffolk County out, in Southampton about a year ago. We're working right now down in Ulster County, around Kingston and Ellenville and New Paltz. We're also working in northern Westchester. We are just kicking off a large project right now with the regional service providers around Rochester. So in 7 counties surrounding Rochester, not in Monroe County itself, but working closely with RTS up there. And so we're really excited to bring some of our tools and approaches that we've developed over the years to Delaware County to think about how best to provide access to mobility and transit service both in your towns and villages, and also across kind of the more dispersed areas of the county. So that really is the goal of this exercise, I think, is to think strategically about how best to provide access to mobility. So, and then also to identify any opportunities to integrate or improve the efficiency of existing services. So both senior transportation and NEMT services as well. Any questions? I'm happy to dive into. I should dive into kind of the approach. We have, a sort of strategy to carry out this project over, I think depending on when we actually kick off, probably the summer and early fall. And okay, there we go. We've got slides now. I don't know if Eric, is there anything that you wanted to highlight before we dive into this, or no? Can't hear you.
No, there's nothing. I think we can. They only want to talk to you, Dan. I'm gonna go to.
I'm sure that's not true, but why don't we? Yeah, that's a nice map. Okay, well we can skip. But why don't we go ahead to the scope, Eric? Just because we think we're sort of case studies. We can talk through case studies here quickly. So Suffolk County, New York, just to give some examples of instances where we did a service planning exercise, and then that ultimately led to some operational service. In Suffolk County, out in Southampton, which I think folks think about as being a pretty Tony area, but there are actually, of course, lots of people working out there and who rely upon public transportation. A route connecting the railroad out there to various areas was discontinued, and so we worked with them to develop an on-demand transit service that would basically connect people, both for general trips in the area as well as to the railroad there. That launched and has been successful. So looking at the next slide, we wanted to highlight a project we did, just across the border in Vermont with the Vermont Agency of Transportation there, which is the state transportation agency, commissioned us to look at Montpelier, Vermont, which is, it's the capital of Vermont, but it's more of a town than a city, really. We have under 10,000 people there, and very seasonal population actually related to the legislative session there as well. So we looked at, basically providing an on-demand service there, designing an on-demand service that would serve healthcare and NEMT trips, but also potentially replace a couple of underperforming fixed routes that they were using there as well. That launched about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, I think at this point. And we're actually doing a statewide study right now with the Vermont Agency of Transportation, where we're working with 6 transit agencies around the state, all of which operate, in basically small towns or rural areas, to think about how on-demand transit can help them to provide better access to mobility to their customers and their residents. And then lastly, wanted to talk about Summit County in Utah, which again is sort of a mix of some more suburban and rural areas. They were looking at launching a new transit service there. they had had a sort of a neighboring transit agency that was providing service for them, but they wanted to take it over themselves. So we did a comprehensive transit development plan, and that ultimately resulted in recalibrating some existing fixed routes, but also launching an on-demand transit service and really coordinating those things. So before we dive into the scope that we've proposed here for Delaware County, maybe we could just tab over to the next slide, Eric, and just pause there and see if there are any questions at this point. So.
Dan and Eric, would you talk just briefly about the difference between an on-demand transit system and one that is established around one that is created around established routes and times and schedules and things like that?
Yeah, sure. You want me to take that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it makes sense. So I'll just say, as kind of a prelude that, on-demand transit, sort of a new term, but really it's a flavor of demand responsive transportation, with some innovations that make it hopefully more efficient, more convenient, and we'll speak to that. But there's a whole spectrum of solutions that kind of fit into that category. It could be pre-scheduled service, it could be dynamic, truly on-demand service where you can kind of turn up and go, and Eric can speak to that. Of course, we do fixed route planning on our team as well. So we always, look at and consider fixed route solutions. There are also, deviated fixed route solutions in the mix. Our general feeling is that deviated fixed route solutions often kind of demonstrate the drawbacks of both fixed route and demand responsive transit without necessarily bringing a lot of benefits. So, it's not usually the first thing that we turn to. But I think we would look at a full spectrum of solutions here, but I think Eric can speak to kind of defining on-demand transit.
Yeah, so when we think of on-demand transit, that experience is such that if you were to book a ride through an app or call in and book a ride, you could expect, generally speaking, someone to pick you up in around, anywhere from like 20 to 30 minutes. So generally speaking, those are kind of more smaller zones where you have a dedicated fleet supply that's large enough to do rides in that amount of time and handle whatever demand is in that zone. So generally smaller areas. For more traditional demand response, like you kind of think about dialysis trips or paratransit trips that are booked anywhere from like a day to a week before, those are not necessarily kind of on demand but pre-booked. And what Dan was talking about with the spectrum is you can have anywhere from a 3-hour pre-book window to 12-hour or even 3-day pre-booked window. And what we've really seen a lot of partners start to do that have a lot of larger areas with large disparate areas with less dense populations is trying to integrate all the mobility services they do have into one system. Basically, that just means you can have the same fleet of vehicles that could be doing demand response pre-booked trips for a large area, but for a smaller area within it, because there's enough trips that might be generated in that area, that same fleet could do on-demand trips in that smaller area. And the ability to kind of commingle shifts and riders on different services and really drive the efficiency through each of the resources that you do have, be that dispatchers or vehicles, is something that we would kind of definitely try and look at, especially for a kind of large rural area. We have a lot of partners from Baldwin County, Alabama, to Hall County, Georgia, to even Wales, that's across the pond, that are doing this kind of mix of pre-booked and on demand. And I think we would, going into it, think that could be a good candidate for a type of service design. But again, we would also look to only do this in a way that really complements and enhances whatever fixed route you are currently running and effectively. So it's supposed to be kind of the right mix of both fixed and demand response for your kind of particular service area network. Does that answer your question, Ray?
It did. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Dan, I think we want to go through what we kind of outlined in our proposal.
Yeah, so if you could just head over to the next slide. So again, just kind of reiterating, the goal is to develop strategies to increase access to transportation across the county, exploring alternatives serving both, sort of the towns and villages across the county, as well as more rural areas, which definitely have different needs and, can be supported in different ways. Considering both dynamic and pre-scheduled models and assessing opportunities to integrate, senior transportation and NEMT. And then just to walk through the very sort of specific tasks of the scope. In terms of product coordination and management, I'll be overseeing the project, and we'll have a couple of members from my team supporting us as well. At the outset, once we have a notice to proceed, we'll schedule a formal kickoff. We'll align on the project goals, the scope, and the work plan, the timeline. And then we'll look to have biweekly meetings, develop meeting minutes and materials for those as well. I think we'll talk to Ray about this, but what may make sense is to basically have one or two folks who are sort of project managers on the county side who will meet with every 2 weeks, and then maybe use this group as some kind of a steering committee, basically, and meet either monthly or bi-monthly, whatever makes sense. But be sure to keep you updated regularly. So once we kick off, the first phase of the project is an existing conditions analysis. So we'll review any existing plans or studies. So the both the prior and the updated coordinated human services transportation plan, and anything else that may be relevant. And then we do kind of a version of a transit market analysis, really looking at demographic and socioeconomic conditions across the county at the block group and census tract level. We have a platform called Remix that we use for this, which is a proprietary planning software that we actually offer to customers, but we also use ourselves. We'll map the existing transit and transportation services as well. So service zones or routes in the case of the senior transportation service, just to understand basically where we see potential need for services, how that differs, where key potential trip generators are, et cetera. We also will kick off, as part of this process, stakeholder engagement, which is shown down there as task 2. We'd have to align on what exactly this will entail, because in our proposal, we've suggested we'll definitely hold stakeholder interviews. Other elements we'd want to settle on with your group and with the project management team at the county. So that will definitely include stakeholder interviews. It could also include a public workshop. It could include focus groups, and so on and so forth. Could potentially include a targeted survey, depending on what we decide is valuable. And that kind of feeds into the existing conditions analysis as well, because it helps us to understand, what's the nature of the need, sort of where do people need to travel that they're finding it challenging to travel now, et cetera. And so we draw on all of that existing conditions analysis and that public engagement to develop different service alternatives for consideration. And that could be adjustments to existing service. It could be, probably not super likely in this case, but if we see obvious opportunities for fixed route service, we would call those out. But it will probably involve the development of one or more on-demand service alternatives. So those could be multiple service zones. They could be different service designs, like, pre-scheduled or sort of fully dynamic on-demand service. For each one of those service alternatives, we'll project the potential demand. So how many people we expect might ride that service. And we do that basically by drawing on our experience operating on-demand services around the world. We have a sense, basically, depending on the characteristics of a service alternative, what percentage of the people that live and work in a zone are likely to ride that on a given day. So we'll develop those demand projections for every service alternative, and then we simulate and model them. So we have a proprietary simulation tool. It allows us basically to simulate kind of a virtual day of service, right? So we develop a demand scenario where we think people are likely going to be traveling within that service zone, how many people are going to be traveling, and we can adjust different parameters, like how long we might expect people to wait for a vehicle. In a denser area, like in a village center, would we ask them to walk to meet a vehicle and how far? And we get outputs basically that show us what the customer experience was like, given those service parameters on that virtual day of service, and also critically, how many vehicles are required to serve that zone, which of course goes to cost, right? So we can understand for different zones with different service parameters, how much will it cost to operate service? And that becomes a critical input for our last task, which is a cost benefit analysis and an implementation strategy. So assessing the trade-offs between the different service alternatives, understanding their costs, the cost per trip, the efficiency essentially, and then working with all of you and with the project management team to settle on a preferred alternative and developing a phased implementation strategy for that preferred alternative or alternatives if we have more than one concept that we're advancing to that stage. So I just talked a lot. Are there any questions that I could answer about the scope?
Dan, once we figure out the mechanics, sign the contracts, and we agree when we're going to kick off and launch, how long does it take to move through these 5 tasks?
Well, I mean, it really depends. I think that probably something like 4 months would be comfortable, but we could also, sometimes it's strategic to actually take a little bit longer, depending on, again, often I find what actually takes the longest is any stakeholder or public engagement that we're doing, just getting that organized and scheduled. And so, I think that, 3.5, 4 months would be reasonable. But if we want, depending on how we want to carry out, any public engagement, or if there are other critical path things that, where it's strategic to hold a key meeting, stakeholder meeting or whatever, like let's say in September or something like that, that could impact things. But, I think that if we kicked off, it's May, if we kick off in June, July, August, I mean, I think, sort of late September, early October, would be a good sort of target to wrap things up.
Wonderful. Anybody have any questions from anyone? Comments?
Yes.
Dan?
It was also brought up, the Hancock Area Chamber of Commerce has their own Transportation Business Relations Committee. And in our area, we have a high demand of clients or people that need to go to work or need to go to MENT appointments in Binghamton. And in the northern part of the county, like the Davenport area, linking into Oneonta for those opportunities, as well as the eastern part of the county with a high amount of clientele need to go to Kingston for medical appointments, work, or shopping. So Dan and Eric, part of this would be, and those counties that Dan just mentioned, Otsego, Bingham, Broome County, Ulster County. Yeah.
Already offer some public transportation options. So I'm guessing that part of this scope of work is how do we link into those existing service providers that join us, correct?
100%. Yeah. And so I think, we would definitely, I mean, I mentioned stakeholder engagement. We'd want to engage, with the folks in Hancock to understand what are the services that are being offered, what's the demand, how can we kind of complement that in a constructive way. Yeah.
Right. And some of that's going to come out when we do those public meetings. We're going to, here in Delaware County, we may end up scheduling more of those than you guys are used to in some areas, because the county is so huge. And our communities tend to be rather parochial, let's say. So we may need to, we may be doing a lot of Zooming in lots of different places here in the county.
right now in the Hancock Deposit area, the southern part of the county, which is served by Coach USA. They only operate 2 trips a day to and from Binghamton, and the scheduling is not feasible for people to do
To work. No.
to work. There's no way when the first bus picks you up at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, gets to Binghamton at 1, and the last bus of the day is at 3:30, 3:29 in the afternoon. Short line services are not feasible. In addition to that is that service doesn't even operate on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. They went with a modified service schedule due to COVID and due to the fact that there is a lack of drivers available to drive these routes. And I know Office for the Aging does offer some services, but it's only for their clientele.
Sure. Any other comments, questions for Dan and Eric? Okay. Amy, Amy Hinges, can I turn to you all? And if you would talk a little bit about the role that DOT may have in this, and really what's the process in order for, once we have that coordinated transportation plan in place, what are the steps that we need to follow to be able to access federal and any state dollars to support this far-flung endeavor here?
Good morning, Ray. I actually have a document that we can share with you. It's just an overview of requirements for participation in state and federal transportation programs that are administered by our office. So there are programs available, but there are obviously regulations and other items that you would have to follow through with and meet in order to receive that type of funding, a reimbursement type of funding that we do. So I have that document. I could send it off to everyone to take a look at it, to peruse it, to see the types of items that you would need, the information that you would have to present to the state, to me, and my bosses, Bill and Tom. And basically the types of possibilities out there could be, and I can't say for sure because we have to know exactly what you're doing and, you know, all the impacts and things like that before we can give you definites, but you could possibly work towards STOA, which is our State Transportation Operating Assistance, or or our 5311 federal funding. That's part federal and part state funding for items that you might need. We have different things in that. 5311 has capital and operating, so there'd be different options there to look at. Of course, we'd have to have all of these items put, you know, all the things that you've been discussing and looking forward to with your coordinated plan and the study that looks like you're trying to complete before any of those other steps could be taken care of course, because they kind of coincide with what you're planning, right?
Absolutely.
So I do have that documentation that I can send to you, and I believe it's on our website too. So I can send you the link for that as well, so you can peruse it. And there's links within the document so that you can look at some of the items and the different programs that apply to what you might be doing.
Super. And I will, and if you forward that to me, Amy, I will forward that to everyone who's on the broader group.
Okay.
That'd be very helpful for us. Has DOT funded through 5311 or you know, some of that federal pass-through funded like an on-demand system? I mean, we're talking about something here that is certainly outside of the typical transportation system, I think.
So I am newer to DOT, so I'm going to defer to my friend Bill Tilofsky and let him give you a response to that.
Great.
Good question. Certainly, the broad systems across the state, a few are engaging in some form of on-demand, using, in certain instances, just some federal dollars to support that. We get into first mile, last mile, but it's really connecting up with the established fixed routes. Just to expand on what Amy said, with the state funding, the State Transportation Operating Assistance, or what we call STOA, it is, you know, traditional bus service funding, 15 or more passenger vehicles unless you get a waiver for it. So certainly, you know, those are things to consider. certainly folks are doing demand response kind of services out there. This, from what Eric and Dan were saying before, this, sounds a little bit more refined, I should say, in terms of trying to narrow the time and wait window and sort of do almost like an Uber like service. So that's something that we'd have to work with you on and look at. But
Bill, how difficult, I think we're gonna be looking for that waiver. How difficult is that? I mean, I can't imagine in a place like Delaware County, last thing that we want is a, I don't know where you fall between 15 passengers and 40. But, certainly we don't want to see those types of vehicles running around the place with only a couple, half a dozen people or something in them. Something that more than 15 passengers doesn't sound like a realistic option for us. I mean, who knows? That's why we're going through this process. But how difficult is it to get that waiver for something a little bit different?
And in the waiver, in the regulations for the STOA program allows for 8 to 14 passenger vehicles.
Indeed.
So, lower than that, I'm not sure if you're talking about lower than that.
No, I think, that 8 to 14, now I think that sounds much more realistic for what I project that we're gonna be looking at here.
In the past, it's usually we would want to see something official from the county making the request, then we would consider granting that waiver. That's generally how it worked in the past.
Okay. And really the purpose of that coordinated plan is to show that need and the appropriate vehicles to meet that particular need.
Mhm. Certainly.
Those vehicles would have to be accessible, wheelchair accessible, correct, Bill, or no?
Yeah, if we're funding them, we need to make sure that they're accessible, or there's an equivalent that if you need an accessible vehicle, it can be dispatched to accommodate the passengers. So that's certainly something to consider. So I think overall, we'll continue to be involved and provide our input and guidance based upon what we see from this group.
Right.
The other thing worth talking about up front is the funding programs. They're an application process for the federal dollars. It's usually on a 2-year cycle, as Amy mentioned. There's federal funds available for operating assistance and capital. Certainly used the couple of places have used the federal dollars to support some first mile, last mile kind of services out there. And the STOA is a quarterly application process when we get to that point. And the other thing to keep in mind too, as we're going down this process, is depending on how you're planning to do the operations, any time there's federal dollars involved, and you're looking to procure an operator, I'm assuming, or several operators. There's procurement procedures and competitive process that have to follow through to make that happen.
Sure. I know that there's one program with an application deadline that's like next month or the month after, and obviously we're not going to be ready for anything like that, but it certainly sounds like there's a steady stream of grant application funding, and Dan and Eric, you guys are certainly well versed in that, and I would imagine that would be part of that program study, the service and operation plan, as well as to identify some of those possible sources of funding to support this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We often, we certainly have worked with agencies that are looking, or governments that are looking at standing up new services. And so we'll, include detailed information basically about, it sounds like we have it right from the source here, but we can just kind of memorialize, the sort of the budget needs, the process for applying for federal or state funds. And then we also can identify potential, competitive grant opportunities, other things that may be helpful in standing up the service.
Wonderful. Tom, Bill, Amy, is there anything else that we need to know at this point from your perspective at New York State Department of Transportation? Anything that we should avoid, anything that, we're certainly going to keep you in the loop on this, and I really appreciate the three of you joining us all this morning. Anything that we need to know, or anything that you want to add?
I'll just add to, which I didn't talk about with the funding programs, there is required local matches to it. So just thought that would be worth mentioning at this point. So with the STOA program, there's a local match, which is about 7% roughly. It's a more detailed calculation that's done, so it's provided, but just in the general ballpark for the STOA operating assistance. And then on the federal dollars, there is a 10% local match on the capital items through the 5311 programs. Certainly put that out there as you're considering, if you're thinking about purchasing vehicles or things like that. Just keep that in mind.
You say a local match. Are there limitations as to where that match comes from?
Yeah.
Does it have to be municipal dollars that provide that match, or can it be?
Yeah, we can get into that, but yeah, there are, it doesn't necessarily have to be local government dollars, but there's certainly things that it can't be. Like you can't use other federal FTA matching funds for it. Certainly we have seen private entities or private businesses come in and support part of that local match. Certainly it's something that we can work with you on understanding, obviously, that local
Ray,
tax
for our 5311, we use like United Way funding for our local match,
Okay.
other foundation funding. I know other entities in New York State can use in-kind funding as their local match. And those just need to be indicated when you do the application.
Okay.
I have another question for DOT. So a lot, I don't know if a lot of the new funding that's kind of been made available in several blocks of it, the Rural Surface Transportation Grant comes to mind. Do those go through New York State also? Are funding sources like that? Or do applications go through New York State to access those funds? And do you know whether those funding opportunities would support projects like this in either the planning phase or the capital or operations phase?
New York State is the recipient from the FTA of the funds. And we disperse those or allocate those funds to our subrecipients, which are our counties or et cetera. So I think that answers part of that question. I am not, I want to, the answer to your full question is kind of, it depends, depending on what you are doing and what the funding is available and if it fits, is kind of where I see it. I don't know if you want to add more to that, Bill.
Yeah, certainly, the funding sources that we administer through DOT that come from FTA are the 5311 program and the 5310 program and some MPO planning funds. So FTA has other funds out there that go direct Which I think, maybe that's what you were talking about, Nick, with the rural surface transportation funds, I think, if I heard you correctly.
Yeah.
Right, so those newer ones that have come out is maybe a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law.
Mm.
Right.
Those
We're
would
still-
go
yeah.
through
sorry.
FTA straight, not through DOT.
Well, we're still learning, and when they come out as a discretionary availability, what it depends what FTA will accept is who is the applicant. That's really we're still learning about those programs.
This is Patty from Delaware Valley Hospital. I have a quick question regarding the matching funds. If you had an organization, say, donating in-kind money, can that be used simultaneously for both federal and state funding if we had two grants at the same time, which I'm assuming we probably would be? Or do you have to have separate? Do they both have to be separate?
You can't apply them to both. I mean, you could say
Sorry?
half of it goes to match the federal, and the other half. I mean, you can't apply it to both programs at the same time.
Okay.
Right. And the other thing I'll say about in-kind match is, there's certain things that you can't use in-kind match. So if you're buying a vehicle, in-kind match isn't going to cut it. You can't pay the vendor with in-kind. They're not going to accept it. So that has to be somebody really putting up real money up on that one.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody have anything else? We're coming up on 11 o'clock, and again, I want to honor your commitment. And are there any other issues, broad issues that we should look at? Before the meeting, Dan Clark told me about something, and I'm going to take advantage of having some folks from DOT here on the line. Dan, why don't you explain what you were talking about with the 5-mile loaded
Okay.
limit?
There was a Medicaid transport through, the Medicaid transportation is administered by New York State Department of Health and dispatched by Medical Answering Services. We're in a dilemma in the rural areas. For example, there was a trip in northern Chenango County that only paid 5 miles inbound, 5 miles outbound. Medicaid will only pay the loaded miles for that recipient. And I know there's vendors out there that would have to travel from their base primarily to do that pickup, to process that pickup and return mostly back to their home base. And they're like Medicaid transportation is very high demand. There's less vendors offering the services, less vehicles offering the services. The issue is, for example, this case in northern Chenango County happened where no Medicaid vendor opted to pick up this enrollee because it would cost more money for them to do the trip than they would get in Medicaid revenue. And I know it happens in a lot of our rural areas of Delaware County right now, where if you got a client in Roxbury needs to go to Margaretville Hospital, the chances of that enrollee getting a trip, even despite the fact they may book it 30 days out, they may not get that ride at all because there's nobody available.
So my question to the group, and maybe someone here knows, and if you don't, that's good too. Is that a federal regulation that is being applied, that's being handed down to the state to administer? Or is that a State Department of Health?
That's all State Department of Health.
Yeah.
That's all State Department of Health. There's a host of things that are happening like that. The challenges for TPs right now in the Medicaid world is tremendous because for a few reasons. Just to get the quick on it, 18% taken after the pandemic, right from the top for any of the work you've done, and you see a 38% in all expenses to operate. So therefore, a trip like that would certainly be a trip that most companies would reassign. And when you reassign them, there's often no one that will accept the assignment. I can tell you my company takes a tremendous amount of trips, and in the need that we have to reassign, what happens is the trip doesn't get accepted and then it's reassigned back to us. And therefore, it's already 2 hours past the appointment time for the person, and that person doesn't get a transport. And there are horror stories, and it's the enrollees, I believe, who need to speak up on that matter, because there's a disconnect. Because even with a recent fuel bump that we received was actually 1.3% that the state gave for a fuel surcharge for transports that we do, 1.3%. I'm on a lot of calls throughout my week with involving those types of discussions. Another thing to be thought of here is you talked about people in need going to Broome County, okay, for transportation. Any transport provider that goes into Broome County, the regulations are extremely arduous as well, much different than most of the other counties that we function in, okay? And it actually is somewhat and that doesn't matter if you're providing. You could be taking someone from Delaware County to Broome and the trip originates in Delaware County. If your vehicle crosses into Broome County, you have to license your vehicle, you have to license your driver, you have to follow all the applicable fees and regulations that are pretty stiff through the Broome County Security Division. That's another challenge that people are facing as we cross into Broome County. So there's a few different things here that will certainly be, as the plan is created, that will certainly pop out. And I think from today's standpoint, once you start to meet and once you start to see what's being developed, people that have the knowledge on exactly what those barriers might be as it's being developed, and they come to the table, you'll be able to craft a plan around those barriers. And I think that's what we need to do. And if we need to involve, legislators or people from the state level to get a better understanding of where we need to go, then by all means, this would be a good time to do that, especially when we're using a company as organized as VIA craft a plan and we're creating the funds to do that. I think this would be a good time to bring some things to light.
Right.
Can I add something on that, please? Gasoline prices and a lot of livery providers have told me their livery insurance has gone up anywhere from 50 to 83% over last year. And I know Al can relate to that. I know a lot of companies have decreased the amount of service they're providing and the amount of vehicles they're providing because of the increased cost. And also it's an issue with getting drivers. A lot of drivers do not want to transport clients that are compromised due to the COVID. You're hearing that all the time as well.
Okay.
It's a snowball effect. And I think even as V is developing the plan, I imagine based on our current environment, for them to provide service or to utilize other available transport options, the cost to provide that service is a lot different now than it was, let's say, in March of 2020. Okay. And it's a much different animal right now because it's not just gas and fuel. Inflation's at 9.2%. Parts for vehicles are up 23%. Purchasing of vehicles to get our hands on vehicles at this point, when we normally might phase out 10 a month, we're lucky if we can get 4, and they're 30% higher and they're not as in good condition either. And to get new vehicles, forget about it. You're on a 6 to 9 month waiting list for that. So, and for our ambulette services and wheelchair services, we buy all new rigs. We have to put orders in. We could wait almost a year to get a vehicle at this point for those types of services. So there's a lot of challenges in this sector. That's why I think if we develop a plan while we're in the most challenging times, and it's a sound plan that can deal with and get through some of those barriers, then we're gonna have a real solid plan when hopefully there's some breathing room into the future, God willing, right? So, while the timing seems rough to have a plan like this developed, if we develop it now while the times are rough, we may have a better future ahead.
Excellent.
We need this plan, and Al hit all the points that I was discussing with Ray earlier.
Good.
You hit it right on the head, Al, and I thank you for that.
Before we wrap up, any final comments from anyone? Lillian and I will put together some notes. Send them out to everybody. Hearing no comments, thank you so much for joining us today. Stay tuned. We'll keep you all informed as to how we're moving forward. Shelley, you and I probably need to get together sometime soon and figure out some of those mechanics with whomever. So we can get Eric and Dan and their team working for us, with us. So thank you all. We'll stay in touch.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you,
much.
everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Nice to
everyone.
meet you.
Have a good
Thank you,
day.
Ray.
Bye.